Hello and welcome to the February edition of the University of Strathclyde's Inspiring Conversations. I'm Manish Joshi, Chief Executive of Strathclyde Students' Union, and in this episode of Inspiring Conversations, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Susie Mitchell, Programme Director for Glasgow City of Science and Innovation. Dr. Mitchell is an inspirational entrepreneurial leader who, throughout her career, has championed diversity and equality in science, technology, engineering and mathematics. In 2016, Susie was recognised by Equate Scotland as a leading woman of Scotland for her contributions to STEM and Scotland's advancement. With a passion for creativity and science, Susie is interested in how multidisciplinary working can generate radical, responsible innovation that tackles societal changes. Welcome, Susie, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Manish. Hi, good to see you.
Good to have you. So, just to kick things off, obviously a bit of a brief introduction there, but tell us a bit more about yourself, where you started, what you do and how you kind of arrived to where you are just now.
Yeah, of course. I was brought up in Pennycook in the east coast of Scotland. And I guess, I felt that the educational system often tried to sort of categorise students into kind of the artsy types or the logical sciencey types, and I was probably bang in the middle. So I loved my music, but I equally had a passion for science, especially biology, and I was fascinated by psychology too. I didn't study it we couldn't study it at school, but my mum's a chartered psychologist, an educational psychologist, so I think that kind of came from her influence. So it was a bit of a tussle between sort of music and science in terms of sort of choosing a career, but I ended up kind of going down the science route. But I would pick up music as a sort of secondary professional career in my 30s. My undergraduate was in cell and molecular biology. So I did that at the University of St Andrews. And then in 2000, I finished my PhD in cancer research. So I did that up at the Beatson Institute in Glasgow. So it's part of the University of Glasgow. And then I suppose I decided to kind of move out of the lab. I became sort of interested in clinical research, and for a year I was in the sort of events industry, producing sort of global pharmaceutical events down in London, and that was really good in terms of just building that knowledge of the pharma sector. And then with that under my belt, I came back to Glasgow to become a research manager for the health board in Glasgow, and that was all about, I guess, demonstrating and managing research, sort of commercial and non-commercial research. It was really a sort of a governance sort of and management role, sort of managing contracts and all of that, and all the clinical trials and research that were happening. Particularly, my focus was the south of Glasgow. So after 5 years there, I really enjoyed that actually, because I was involved in the setup of that office. And then I sort of decided to move on into health and equality policy within the local authority in Glasgow. So it was my job, I guess, to not only develop local authority-led health policy for the city, but also to devise tools and processes to help to integrate health and equality considerations into all council policies. I guess for 1 year of that, I was seconded to Scottish Government, which was great to do a particular project on developing an integrated impact assessment combining health, human rights and equality. So I really enjoyed that actually, and we ended up publishing that tool. So I think it was the World Health Organization published it, and then it was kind of rolled out across the NHS. And then when I went back to the local authority in Glasgow, we used that model to undertake a health and equality impact assessment of the Commonwealth Games, which ended up, sort of influencing the legacy recommendations for the Games. Sorry, I've got a lot. I jumped around quite a lot.
It's fascinating.
But then I moved on. So then I moved on to the Commonwealth Games itself. So after 4.5 years of policy making, I was the Accessibility Inclusion Manager for the Commonwealth Games, so for the organising committee itself. So that was great because I'd been involved in sort of developing those legacy recommendations, and then I could actually help to try and implement them sort of as part of the organising committee, which I think is quite unusual. You don't usually find in a mega sporting event somebody who's worked for Legacy and then somebody who's worked for the delivery sort of organising agency. And I guess as a little kind of bonus, I suppose, when I worked in the Commonwealth Games, I got, I suppose, a once in a lifetime opportunity to co-write and perform backing vocals at the closing ceremony. So a couple of friends and I, got to sing in front of a global audience of 1.4 billion people, which was utterly terrifying, but amazing at the same time. Sorry, Manish, that was a long answer to your question, but that takes me to where I am now as director at Glasgow City of Science and Innovation.
That is a fascinating journey. We could talk about life on the East Coast. I kind of grew up in Dalkeith, so not too far from Penrith, and it's interesting. I feel like there must be some kind of like equation that takes place when people from the east move to the west. There's a similar move from people from the west to the east, but it seems to balance itself out quite well. But just really fascinating, I guess, in terms of your background, both academically, but also in terms of delivery, and I guess even thinking about legacy and what that means within the context of innovation and enterprise. Here in Glasgow, where I guess we've got a strong history. Being at University of Strathclyde, thinking about some of the great innovators that have come through these doors and continue to come through these doors, but I guess how we build on that legacy and how we impact the communities that surround us here in Glasgow. Some of the most deprived communities in Scotland are not a stone's throw away from our institutions and from the areas in which we live. And I guess, what role do you think innovation has in tackling some of those societal disparities that we see?
I think you're absolutely right. And I think when we look at research programs and I think how they're structured, I actually think whether you're a company or representing almost like a microcosm of society or any sort of organization, or whether you are a local authority looking at how you tackle challenges on the ground, I think increasingly we now need almost like a sort of North Star vision, or we need to base what we're trying to do on sort of societal challenges rather than research questions. So I think we almost sort of need to sort of think more broadly, okay, what is the challenge that we're trying to fix, and who are the diverse minds that we need to get together to sort of fix that. So I don't think we can be as linear as we have been in the past. And we've often sort of thought, I guess, about sectors, sort of individual sectors. I'm not entirely sure how helpful that is. I wonder if we need to think about, again, what are the real life challenges that we're trying to fix, and and how do we sort of use our rich innovation assets, because somewhere like Glasgow, we're so lucky. We've got so many skills and innovation assets within a relatively small geography. So how do we coordinate those and in a sort of coherent way and a really impactful way, whereby we can take a sort of challenge-led approach and bring in all the right people to design sort of the transformational solutions that will really have an impact on communities and inclusive shared growth.
Yeah, and I guess you've got quite a unique experience, Susie, having worked, I guess, closely with local authorities, worked with national government, working with academic institutions. What do you see as, I guess, some of the challenges and the opportunities within those relationships to really kind of make, as you said, that transformative societal change? Because I think there's a lot of messing around the edges with things, but it's you talked about policy earlier on, like what some of the policy changes you think need to happen to help us kind of move things forward. Like, where's some of the, I guess, where's that kind of nexus for you in some of that?
Yeah, it's funny. I remember a few years ago, I sat in a conference, and we were discussing similar things. And in terms of the Glasgow context, I don't think we quite realise how lucky we are in terms of the relationships, the tacit relationships between the universities, the town and gown relationships, as we would say, and our connection to kind of local communities. Because actually, that meeting was in Turin, and I remember the Italians kind of saying, "God, you're so lucky," because actually the innovation community doesn't have as good a relationship with its local authority. So we need to capitalise on that. Now, there isn't a silver bullet that will answer that question, but there needs to be systemic and systematic sort of changes to kind of what we have and what we're doing to support communities. And I think that goes from everything from skills, education. Education is obviously absolutely critical to sort of everything, and we need to invest in young people from underrepresented communities who are tackling, are having to, every day they sort of have challenges that they're facing, but we need to invest in those young people. Often it comes down to resource, and I know that's difficult sort of in these times. We need to prioritise resource, but I think education and giving those young people equality of opportunity is absolutely critical to sort of rebalancing. I also think we need to think about things like civic innovation practices and trying to kind of roll those out again, something that really needs to be ingrained into policy making. I found it difficult, I guess, as a policymaker sometimes when we were doing things like equality impact assessment, and again trying to sort of integrate considerations of equality and health into all council policy, into housing, into employability, physical activity, everything. It's quite difficult if you don't have. It's not just about having equality champions. It's actually about having that mindset sort of across policy making, sort of within. You can't just have one person that's preaching to people.
The point you make about systemic change, isn't it? Is we have to change the institutions and the structures that we have.
Yeah, and it's about education, and it's about education from the top down as well. So we need our leaders to be pushing the equality agenda, and they need to understand, and they need to be trained in it. Councillors need to be trained in equality and inclusion. So there needs to be accountability, I think, within governments, within companies, at a really senior, C-suite sort of senior level when it comes to, if we're talking about diversity and inclusion, so I think, I think there needs to be policies. But I think there needs to be accountability. We need to sort of measure our progress when it comes to these things, and it's not. It can't be a sort of a nice to have or just a policy that sits there. It needs to be measurable, like the other things that we kind of measure. So, I think education is key, and I think a sort of almost like purpose-led, top-down sort of leadership is really, really, really important in seeing those sort of systemic and transformational changes that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm sure we will come back to that well as we go through the conversation. But maybe going back to your career in science, you talked obviously about this kind of fork in a road at one point between science and music. And so what inspired you, or who inspired you to pursue a career in science?
Well, I suppose I had, it's probably a mixture of nature and nurture to a certain extent. So I was always, I suppose, as a child, quite sort of curious. I was always my poor mum. I was always pulling things apart and putting them back together again, and I was just quite sort of curious. So I think I was always a bit sort of practical and sciencey in that sort of sense. But I was always really musical as well. God, I love things like, I used to love Sesame Street. They always had people like Prince and Stevie Wonder on there, and I was transfixed from like a really, really young age. So I was big into music. I used to write a lot of music myself when I was quite young at home, but I was quite shy, so I didn't particularly want to sort of perform it in front of people, so I kind of did it for my own sort of interest. But so I mean, I think my dad is the first black professor in Scotland, and he's been sort of, he didn't come from a traditional, I guess, sort of academic background. Dad didn't really have much of a formal education until he was 12, and then fast forward however many years, he would become knighted for his contributions to science and also sort of human rights. So I think having that influence at home is obviously going to influence you when it comes to the career path you choose. But also my mum, my mum influenced so many children's lives through social science, through psychology. She specialised in autism and Asperger's. So I think being surrounded by that naturally, and I was probably, to be honest, a bit more confident as well about going down the science route, because the music for me at that point wasn't about performing. It was more about just a hobby that I absolutely loved, but I probably wasn't confident enough to kind of do that or to think about pursuing that as a career at that point in my life.
Right. Okay. No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, when you entered into that kind of world of science, what were some of the barriers and the obstacles that you faced? I guess due to your gender, ethnicity, and how have you kind of tackled that in your career? And I guess what are some things you might say to those that are maybe find themselves at an early stage on a similar journey?
Do you know what? I often get asked this, but I don't think I was discriminated against. And I know people probably don't. They probably don't want to hear that, but I didn't. I didn't feel it. I didn't feel like I was held back by anyone, particularly, to be honest, Manish. But I guess what we talk about in the job that I'm in now is that we know that, I guess maybe if I was going to pursue a career in the lab, I might have felt it more. I left after my PhD, although I have worked in research and science in some level, sort of since then. But what we know and what is evidenced is that diversity and a better representation within workforces is a driver of innovation, right? So teams that come up with better solutions and more transformational solutions will have different voices around the table, different viewpoints, different expertise, different life experiences. So I'm sure, a lot of your listeners will have heard about things like, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. So, so seat belts, headrests, and airbags, sort of in cars. They've been designed using data specifically from, so data collected from car crash dummies, tested, based on the physique of men and their seating position, right? So women's body shapes, including pregnant women, don't feed into the standard measurements. So as a result, women are nearly 50% more likely to be seriously injured than a man in a similar accident. So, and that's because it's been men that have been developing, the technologies for testing the safety of cars. Similarly, during the pandemic, you probably heard about, that wasn't too long ago, I think it was in November, it was reported that the pulse oximeters that were used during the pandemic are calibrated for and mainly tested on light-skinned people and can give errors for non-white people. So in a pandemic where we have seen, inequalities exacerbated, exposed, and then, we're adding to that by having sort of tech that is discriminatory. We need to, so again, it's thinking about these things and making sure that we have diverse and representative voices, innovating solutions to problems that work for all of us. So, and again, in terms of that women in science thing, we know that women represent I think it's about 30% of researchers globally, and so I guess since science, tech, innovation is about creating a better world for all of us, we talked about this actually during COP, when we were talking about the climate emergency. The best problem solvers are often those that experience a problem firsthand. So we need to, in order to sort of come up with the best solutions to global problems and to reduce these kind of inequalities, we have to understand, and that was, I guess, a big part of my career, we have to understand the differential impacts of these challenges on different groups of people, including women, actually. And women are more impacted, for example, by the climate emergency. So, and again, we need to take intentional action to make sure more women and other equality groups are addressing these issues, whether they be innovators or decision makers or community actors. So, yeah. So my personal experience, I really don't think I did. I don't think I was sort of held back, managed, but I think the system, yeah, we need to do something again about underrepresented people within workforce, including women, because there's a lot of challenges out there, and we need, and a lot of untapped talent. So we need to make sure that everybody's around the table.
Yeah, and there's a real dichotomy there, isn't there? Because I guess people have talked about the pandemic opening up the world of flexible work, yet
Mm-hmm.
women remain more impacted by the
Exactly.
effects of the pandemic. So, whilst on one hand you've got employers who maybe for the first time have realised that productivity doesn't decline when you give people agency and actually allow them to build their life around their work, it's still impacting on women because of caring responsibilities, because of the inequality that's already kind of baked into the system. And I guess it'd be interesting to hear what are some things that you think organisations could be doing to try and um, level up that playing field and to really address the disparity that I guess is within our systems at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, to take the example of, I think you're right, and I think in terms of women in general, if you look at sort of, we were talking about sort of women in STEM roles, for example, I guess workplaces, there's definitely some inbuilt sort of bias again, sort of into the system, and I think there are systemic changes on a number of levels. I think that workplaces need to look at. For example, for women, I think there needs to be things like mentorship. We need to look at things like work-life balance and decisions, in relation to that, career decisions. I think mentorship and dialogue really, really helps. There are definitely, we need to target these kind of subtle biases and stereotypes and organizational policies such as family-friendly policies. And as you say, that really came to the fore in the pandemic. I know a lot of people, I still know a lot of women actually who work in science who were trying to juggle, teaching their kids their schoolwork and trying to kind of, God, when am I going to be able to go into the lab and do my lab work and do all this and other sort of caring responsibilities. So those kind of things, organizational policies, HR policies can hinder the advancement of women, for example, in STEM careers and other careers. And again, I guess what the pandemic has highlighted is the absolute importance of flexibility, and flexible working, and certainly, I had a child nearly 2 years ago, and yeah, I mean, it's a real eye opener for me in terms of that, just needing that flexibility, so that you can balance work life and home life.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you chatted earlier on about COP, so I guess I was interested. Obviously, COP felt like something that was kind of done to Glasgow, as opposed to Glasgow necessarily get to really participate in it as fully as we did, say, with the Commonwealth Games, which you mentioned earlier on. But I just wondered what your kind of experience of COP was and what some of the legacy elements might be from that.
So our role in COP was to sort of promote and make visible the sort of science innovation, I guess, that was happening in the city region, and to promote that sort of locally and kind of internationally. And it is really impressive, I guess, what's happening on the ground. And that's important for a number of reasons. It's important so that we can tell one another what we're doing, look for opportunities for collaboration locally and internationally, and also have that conversation about the role of girls and women in tackling the climate emergency. And that's something else that we did as well. And we held an event specifically to bring together women across Scotland, actually, not just in Glasgow. And also we had some international visitors as well that were coming to COP to highlight some of, again, the amazing local and international women working in science, like real sort of amazing sort of role models at different points in their careers. And we brought in some young women from schools in Glasgow to inspire them to get into sort of climate science. And so don't get me wrong, there are obviously massive challenges that we need to address when it comes to kind of the climate emergency. And I don't want to brush that under the carpet, but I guess these huge events, whether it's the Commonwealth Games or, whether it's COP, for me, I take a sort of positive view of them in terms of sort of, let's use it. Let's use it to accelerate change. Let's use it as a catalyst to do something different. Let's have a debate about the difficult issues. But for me, it in terms of what we were doing, it was a real positive experience. And yeah, I would suggest that anyone listening goes to have a look at our Innovating to Net Zero campaign and just get a feel for the breadth of really sort of important world-changing research that is happening in relation to kind of climate science, just in our little city region alone.
Yeah, no, and I think you're totally right. It is fascinating. I think you do a trawl through what Glasgow academics and organisations are involved with, whether it's from climate justice through to microplastics and everything else. The carbon neutral kind of district that the innovation district's part of, and the work around the Clyde and all that. Glasgow got a pretty ambitious target to get to net zero, and it's happening around us. So I think it is definitely something students are interested in. We're more and more seeing students coming in, really asking straight away what we're doing around sustainability, what's happening on climate, how can I get more engaged and involved. And so, it's definitely at the forefront of people's minds. I think that there's a lot of climate anxiety comes with that as well, but I definitely think looking at solutions and some of the positive aspects is well worth it.
We're kind of focusing on a couple of things. So we're focusing on overarching kind of theme is digital transformation, but we're looking specifically at diversity as a driver of innovation, and we're also looking at environmental, social and governance practices within business. And the government are trying to sort of not just kind of like large corporates, but particularly looking at SMEs, small to medium sized enterprises, in relation to how they can contribute to climate action. I guess as SMEs is the backbone of our economy. There's more SMEs than anything else, in terms of companies. So and that's great. But again, we need to make sure, I guess, that those companies are getting the support that they need to implement, and the knowledge that they need to implement particular technologies or practices or whatever it might be to kind of green themselves and to support the collective efforts in relation to kind of climate action. But it's quite interesting because now what we're finding is whether it's customers, and you mentioned young people there, Gen Z or whoever are, they're now voting with their feet, so they're looking for companies that represent them and who are relevant, in today's society. And that means representative workforces, diversity. A lot of these companies are having to look at a social reset, particularly with social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. People are looking for that, so those social movements have forced a social reset in large companies as well as small companies. And similarly, investors are now saying it's our reputation. We want to invest in companies that are looking at sustainability, green issues, that have diverse boards, all of those things. So I think that's good, so if they're all of these things, I guess, are sort of like key sort of discussion points that we need to kind of get out of in the open. But really, really important to kind of make that sort of transformational shift in where we are in relation to some of these issues.
And what role does Glasgow City of Science and Innovation have then in terms of, I guess, supporting and enabling that diversity on boards and in workforces and things like that? Like, how are you involved in that?
So I guess, so I don't know so basically Glasgow City of Science and Innovation, for people that don't know, is an innovation partnership. So our role is we were established really to sort of to support, to showcase, to better connect, I guess, the rich assets within the innovation ecosystem within Glasgow and the west of Scotland. So, and we do that by curating a portfolio of sort of flagship projects and programs. So I talked about sort of mapping and sort of promoting what's happening, so our world-class strengths, and what's sort of happening on the ground. But in relation to the question that you've asked, we also sort of develop programs to help companies to innovate across different dimensions of their business. And as I said, and that really sort of that hopefully will support them in terms of remaining relevant, but also to help them to become more resilient companies, and companies that are more resilient to kind of future shocks. So hopefully there's almost that balance of sort of productivity, people and planet. So what we do is we run, for example, the Summit and our Art of Possible series, where we are broadcasting and sharing knowledge, I guess, around some of these issues. So we hear from companies who are doing, are implementing, for example, digital transformation or diversity or environmental, social and governance issues in our, and are succeeding in relation to those things. So they can kind of share what they've done. But we also have support agencies, present who, and again, we are so lucky in Scotland, international companies come to Scotland and Glasgow because the support that we have for innovation is extraordinary. What I would say though, is that for some small companies, it is really difficult to navigate.
Just to wrap up, maybe a few more personal questions then. You've talked a bit about your parents and your family and your background, but who are some of the most influential people in your life, and how have they impacted you?
I find this a really difficult question. I mean, obviously, I think, my mum and dad, obviously my parents, for the reasons that I've kind of outlined sort of earlier, as well as, I guess, my mum, in terms of the fact she juggled, being a mum and also being an amazing sort of psychologist. I think that's really important, actually, for children to see that. You don't realise when you're little, do you? You don't realise what's influencing you. You're living. But I think sort of that balance is kind of really important to be able to sort of see that. That's really important in terms of that sort of role model, because it just is. I think I've been, I was thinking about this the other day, and when I was in primary school, there was a because somebody asked me what teachers kind of influenced you, and there was a teacher called Mr. McCall in Eastfield Primary in Pennycook, and he was so creative. He was really into his music, and he was really into kind of talking about different cultures and just really sort of bringing music into different aspects of education and teaching. And I think he really influenced me, actually, sort of musically. I got him, and he definitely was sort of really influential. I mean, I was always quite musical even when I was quite young, but he sticks in my mind as somebody. I mean, I still remember the songs that he made up for, various projects that we did. It's kind of ingrained in my head.
It's like it still stays with you.
It really does. And then, I guess there's different people, isn't there, at different points in your sort of professional and other kind of life experiences that you'll never forget. And I suppose when I came to Glasgow, in terms of my music, I joined the Glasgow Gospel Choir, which was a sort of non-religious, I suppose, sort of community choir. We used to sing sort of gospel house music in the sub club and the buff club, and I did not have the confidence to perform in public. And Jerry Bowie, Jerry was a Liberian refugee who fled, war-torn Liberia, and he was looked after really by Glasgow, and he now describes himself as a Glasberian. It's really sort of integrated into the culture of Glasgow. Jerry's an amazing musician, absolutely amazing. So we used to sing in his Bassa language, and the African sort of harmonies were just beautiful. But yeah, we used to do a lot of sort of club nights, and he really encouraged me to start doing leads. I mean, I never sang. I used to sing in my bedroom, or play the piano when everybody went out the house. But I would not have I would not have described myself as a singer, but Jerry, that was my training ground really, and he gave me the confidence. I remember the first time I sang myself in the West End, I was actually physically sick the night before. I was so nervous. So to go from that to, I guess, singing in front of 1.4 billion people in the Commonwealth Games, it just shows you though, doesn't it? You know, if you meet the right people kind of along the way to kind of support you, you can do anything at any sort of point in your life. So Jerry was, you know, really central in enabling, I guess, you know, and that would lead, I ended up, you know, I'm now a session vocalist, and I do some sort of composition as well. So none of that would have happened had I not, you know, nervously gone along to that first gospel choir.
It's amazing. I guess back to your point, you know, your network and I guess mentors and people who take you under their wing. I guess it's so important both in professional and personal life. You know, just somebody to kind of look out for you and encourage you, be in your corner. I guess just kind of, you know, willing you on is so important. I think going out and finding those people is
yeah, and sometimes
all be doing more of.
Yeah, sometimes you can make it happen by finding a mentor, and sometimes, you know, often actually it's chance and often I suppose self-motivation and putting yourself maybe in uncomfortable positions sometimes, but giving things a go.
All the people who have probably had the most influence on me, I have been the annoying person that has kind of just got in front of them and kind of made a relationship happen when they're too busy or whatever. But it's interesting, you look back on some of them and you just, you know, you're maybe foolish or naive, or you just thought, oh, I'll have a go at this. But I do think it's important to try and find people that you can, you know, that you respect and that you look up to, but who can really invest in you. And I sometimes think that's a two-way street as well, because I think you often get quite a lot back from those relationships if you're the mentor.
Absolutely.
And I guess just to finish then, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received, and would you share that advice with people today?
Yeah, do you know, I think for me, I think rather than advice, I there's a quote by Maya Angelou that I absolutely love, and it's quite to the point, but I just love it. And it's, if you don't like something, change it, and if you can't change it, change your attitude. I just love that. So I guess, yeah, that's something that I often sort of think about in life, sort of in general. So yeah, I think if you can't, I think that's one of those kind of quotes where you kind of think, that's right, you know, move on if you're not enjoying something, and if for whatever reason you can't move on, you know, just change your attitude to it.
I think that's a great piece of advice to leave us on. Dr. Susie Mitchell, thank you very much for taking the time to talk with us today. Thank you for joining us, and remember to tune in next month where we'll be joined by another inspiring entrepreneurial leader. To find out more about Strathclyde Inspire and our Inspiring Conversation series, please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter, or search for Strathclyde Inspire on the University of Strathclyde's website. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.